So there we go. I'm going to go back to the conversation. Hi, folks. Okay, so we have started recording now. A few more people are starting to turn up, so I'll just keep an eye on that as well as we go. Welcome and thanks to everybody for taking the time for joining us today. I'm Rob McMorran. You'll have seen the emails over the last few days from me in relation to organising this. I'm a researcher in the Rural Policy Centre at Scotland's Rural College. So welcome to this.
I'm slightly lumpy. Anyway,
I'm just going to ask folks to turn off their microphones. A little bit of housekeeping at the start. You can just mute yourselves and keep your microphones off unless you're actually speaking. And we suggest when we're doing the discussion phase towards the end, we suggest using the hand raising function, which is in the top right hand corner, or just turn your camera on and stick your hand up. Or if none of those work, just shout at us and we'll get to you eventually. And you can also post comments and questions in the chat function in the right-hand side. And Jane Gaff, who's also here, has kindly agreed to keep an eye on that if we do lose track of that at any stage. Okay. So thanks again for taking the time to joining us. The workshops, I should say, are the result, or I suppose the final stage, really, of a safari fellowship, which was undertaken with Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park, and that began properly in the middle of last summer and was completed relatively recently. And the initial plan had actually been to do lots of face-to-face engagement as part of that, but of course the pandemic had other ideas. But that didn't stop us achieving a fairly high level of engagement with owners and managers and forestry consultants and stakeholders across the park. And thanks are due to all of those who took part and really made the research process possible. I've put up in the meeting chat the outputs. So there's a briefing, a summary briefing, and also a final report from the fellowship. And you've also been sent links to those by email. So today really is about communicating some of the findings from that work to you, but also I'm going a little bit broader and sharing information and experiences from yourselves, particularly in the second half of the workshop, but also from our speakers today. And I'm very grateful to them for taking the time to come along. And we've got 4 speakers. And what I might do just now is ask each of the speakers in turn to just briefly introduce themselves, say their name, who they are, and who they work for, and what their role is. So if I maybe start with that and turn to Simon. Simon, do you want to maybe say hello to folk?
Hello everyone, my name's Simon Franks. I'm the Trees and Woodlands Advisor for the Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park, and was working with Rob on this project with him. And
Tom, was that?
Good afternoon everyone, I'm Tom Davis from Scottish Forestry, Perth and Argyll Conservancy, and I'm the Senior Ops Manager in the Conservancy. We deal with woodland creation schemes across the National Park in both approval and funding through the FGS.
Great, thanks Tom. And Andrew?
I'm Andrew Vaughan. I'm the North Scotland Regional Manager for Till Hill, which is, I suppose, a glorious title, but basically I've been living and working in Perthshire for over 30 years, and we've been doing lots of planting and woodland management throughout the national park for a long time. I hope to share those sort of findings with you today.
Brilliant, thanks Andrew. So that's our speakers, and we'll come back to that shortly, but I also just wanted to pass you over briefly to Andrew Keelow, who's here from Safari Gateway, just to say a few words about Safari and the Safari Fellowship model, Andrew, if you don't mind.
Hi, thanks Rob. Hi, my name is Andrew Keelow. I'm a Research and Communications Manager for Safari Gateway. So in case you don't know, Safari Gateway is the knowledge exchange and impact hub for Safari, and that is the Scottish Environment, Food and Agricultural Research Institutes. And as a collective of 6 institutes, Safari delivers a multi-million-pound portfolio of strategic research funded by the Scottish Government. So the aim of Safari Gateway is to improve the flow of research, knowledge and expertise from the strategic research to our stakeholders. And one of the main ways we do this is through our flexible funded programs, and fellowships are one of the most popular schemes. So Fellowships are essentially knowledge exchange and engagement opportunities for staff within Safari to work closely with key partners. These projects tend to take a partnership approach and adopt an iterative design, leading to really highly bespoke projects tailored to stakeholder needs. Generally, the fellows are funded for a maximum of 50 days to deliver the project and are supported by a steering group that helps them access people and resources and also helps manage the project. Gateway also provides extra funding for things like workshops and events, and can provide that as and when these needs emerge. So since 2016, we've launched sort of close to 20 fellowships and worked with partners such as Nature Scot, SEPA, NFUS, Cairngorm National Park, and of course, Rob has led the fellowship with Loch, Lomond and Trossachs National Park. So I just want to say how happy we are with Rob's work, and I'd like to congratulate him for publishing his report as well. So that was a very quick sort of overview of fellowships. I'll put my email in the chat bar, so if you have any questions about that, or even potentially want to explore a potential idea for a fellowship, then yeah, please get in touch. So yeah, back over to you, Rob.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for that. So I think I'll just go ahead and see if I can screen share here. Yeah. Just kick off the first. So, okay, so can I just check that you can see my slides okay and they're in full screen?
That's fine, Rob.
Yeah, okay, brilliant, thank you. And just a reminder to everyone to just keep the microphones off for the time being until we get to the kind of the discussion stage, okay? So I just wanted to take you through some of the key findings from this process that have been undertaking in the Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park. In terms of the sort of context of this work, as you all know, the Scottish Government have quite a strong emphasis currently on new woodland expansion, and that has been increasing in recent years in Scotland. And regionally, there is also this target within the National Park Partnership Plan for an additional 2,000 hectares of woodland by 2023. And we also have the Trees and Woodland Strategy. And also important to point out, contextually, there's quite a high level of woodland cover within the National Park already, 31%, and 62% of that is productive conifer, the majority of which is owned under the National Forest Estate. And a key point here is that there's been comparatively low uptake of woodland creation in the National Park in recent years relative to some other parts of Scotland. So that's kind of a key aspect to the, in relation to the genesis of this fellowship, which set out to look at the drivers for land manager decision making in relation to the creation of new woodlands to improve understanding how some of those constraints can be overcome in practice. And at the outset of this, I did a rapid evidence assessment and just a few headline kind of findings from this, which went on to sort of to inform the approach to the research. The first is from this Mills et al. Study, which looked at influences on farmers in relation to their environmental management decision making, and categorized those influences into three broad categories: their willingness to change, which relates to things like their self-identity, their personal beliefs and attitudes or social norms, and also their ability to change, which relates to things like capacity and finances and so on, and a third sort of overarching one of engagement and knowledge transfer, and that might relate to the role of advisors or farmer networks. And a second key area that emerged from this was this idea that behavioural change occurs on a pathway or in specific stages, and that might relate to something like a change in ownership, or a threat like climate change, or a new opportunity like, for example, woodland carbon markets. And this idea that nudges, which could be a small change to an application process, for example, or some sort of knowledge transfer, at these specific kind of intervention points can actually substantially alter or change behaviours. And also this idea that decisions are a product of socio-economic and environmental context. They're not generic. Owners are on different trajectories in different areas related to sort of embedded land use models. And so this idea of a participatory regional investigation, like what we've done in the national park, are important for recognising this sort of role of context and kind of locally specific issues or narratives. And so in terms of addressing that then, as well as doing that evidence assessment to sort of establish a research framework, I undertook 5 scoping interviews with some of the key stakeholders operating regionally and more widely. And also the core of this really related to 17 landowner manager interviews, which were quite well spread in terms of sizes, different types. We included farms, some conservation holdings, and some larger estates, spread across different regions in the park and with different levels of potential woodland capacity. And also spoke to interviewed 9 of the agents and consultants, most of the agents and consultants really operating within and around the national park area. And we're kind of at this stage now of doing this feedback, doing these workshops, and also engaging with other stakeholders. So in terms of some of the findings, and across the sample, there was around about 6,500 hectares or so of existing woodland within the landowner sample. And the majority of those that I spoke to viewed woodland creation quite positively, and 10 of those were exploring specific new woodland schemes. And that related to sort of an aspirational area of potential new woodland of around about 14 to 1,500 hectares over the next 5 years or so. And that would be quite substantial in that it would equate to a 20% increase in woodland cover on these specific holdings. And that related to a mixture of different types of schemes. The bigger ones tended to be mixed commercial native schemes, also some native schemes for biodiversity, immunity, or some for carbon, and also natural regeneration schemes as well, some interest in those. And also recognition that natural regeneration was happening in a number of areas across the park anyway, largely due to reductions in grazing pressures. Important to say the sample is not really meant to be perfectly representative of all of the landowners and managers across the park. It was more of a purposeless sample, and so it's more likely that the owners in the sample would tend to be interested in this sort of thing anyway. And important also to say that there's a certain amount of uncertainty and hesitancy very definitely evident even within this sample. These owners and managers were at very different stages, and so it's quite difficult to say how much of this aspiration woodland cover will actually become a reality over the next few years. And related to that, and that's why really these factors influencing woodland creation become quite important. And I've broken these down in terms of what I found through the interviews. I've broken these down into 3 broad initial categories: individual, social, and cultural; economic factors like markets, profitability, and incentives; and then environmental constraints, capacity, and resourcing. And a sort of cross-cutting theme that cuts across all of these is this theme of knowledge transfer, expertise, and engagement, and the role of that. So if we take a look at each of these in turn then, and each of them has sort of sub-themes, and the first sub-theme for this individual social one is really to do with owner-manager attitudes. And across the sample, there was a consistent emphasis on business viability and the importance of retaining your business long-term. And that was aligned with an environmental emphasis and also an emphasis on rural sustainability, particularly on the larger land holdings, but also on some of the farm holdings as well. Forestry tended to be linked to a certain extent with a loss of farmer identity and confidence by some of the interviewees. And this idea of succession or a change in ownership was repeatedly identified as a critical intervention point for land use change, for addressing or altering some of these very embedded land use models. Second sub-theme here related to cultural factors, social aspects, particularly an emphasis on the role of peer networks. Essentially your neighbour, what your neighbour is doing, whether you're communicating with your neighbour, this idea of word of mouth, repeatedly linked to woodland uptake. Have you seen and experienced somebody else doing a successful scheme? Practical disconnect is evident between farming and forestry, linked to sort of a limited development of woodland culture, a lack of skills among some of the land managers in relation to forestry. And also this idea that if you had undertaken a previous scheme, that tended to decrease your perceived risk and increase your interest in doing future schemes. Just going to take that away there. The third sub-theme here, perception of regulatory controls and sort of local governance structures, and some criticism of the timescales for scheme approvals apparent, particularly among some of the forestry agents and consultants, referring to timescales of sort of 12 to 18 months to get a scheme through the feedback consultation phase. Also perceived higher risks and costs associated with schemes in the national park due to the specific sensitivities in the park. And also some interviews referring to a perceived sort of undervaluing of productive forestry evident within the National Park Authority from their perspective. The new woodland strategy generally seen quite positively, but also referred to by some as a high-level document, and some questions asked about whether or not some of the objectives within that would be supported with more sort of targeted approaches in the future. The second key theme then, the sort of markets aspect, and rising timber and forestry land values in particular is seen as an increasingly important driver, particularly for investments and sort of larger scale investment forestry schemes. And sort of parallel with that, or aligned with that, is reference to agricultural outputs. Actually, land price is quite high at the moment, but that's offset against longer term uncertainty in relation to Brexit, agricultural support payments longer term, and how those relate to sort of hill farm viability, and how that's feeding into farmer thinking about what they might do with their land. And this increased recognition of the need to diversify for sort of longer term financial sustainability. Forestry income timescales related to, a more common farmer emphasis on the need for an annual income, and also the perceived sort of financial risk or capital outlay for a forestry scheme before you get to sort of positive cash flow situation. But that's offset against recognition of increasing potential for generating income from biomass and wood fuel, and also the potential of short rotation forestry or shorter conifer rotations in particular, seen by some as potentially starting to close the farm forestry divide. Carbon market's an interesting one, lots of interest in this, but also quite a lot of uncertainty as it's an emergent market. Questions asked in relation to sort of transparency currently, potentially some overstating of values in relation to carbon, and whether or not carbon schemes are suitable for smaller schemes on farms, and whether or not you can get your scheme through the additionality requirement with the Woodland Carbon Code, where you need to show that your scheme wouldn't be financially viable without the additional income from the carbon. And also questions in relation to whether or not you might need to actually retain your carbon as opposed to selling it off through your accredited scheme, where you might need to offset some of your own emissions in the future. So people expressing some concerns around that as well. It's quite an interesting area there in relation to carbon, and also related to kind of markets aspects. Grants tended to be perceived as fundamental to enabling woodland creation for those that were interested in it in the first place, but that was weighted against the compatibility of new woodlands with the existing business model and the ethos of the holding. And in general, the current forestry grant scheme tended to be viewed very positively, but there is a perception of comparatively lower grant rates in the national park, due particularly to the fact that the Central Scotland Green Network top-up, which you get on top of your grant in the Central Scotland area. And so questions asked in relation to whether or not there's scope for a further top-up or supplement within the national park to sort of drive woodland creation. A couple of other aspects in relation to the grants. Issues raised in relation to the risk of scheme failure and a loss of grant as a determinant of grant attractiveness. You can lose your grant if you're not getting sufficient sort of growth rates and so on. And also the slow time scale in relation to achieving a positive cash flow situation and the related sort of risks associated with that. The third kind of key theme then, the environmental aspects, the constraints here really related to things like deer impacts, grazing pressures, physical constraints like the cost of fencing on steep ground or access, but also other aspects like plant health concerns raised in relation to plant health and also designated sites, peat and landscapes. And these constraints collectively increase owner and manager perception of risk in relation to things like tree survival rates and woodland schemes generally. Do you have enough land? Some resistance to loss of ground for deer or livestock grazing apparent, but also probably a certain level of recognition of the potential for woodland to complement existing land uses, but also lack of scale efficiencies apparent for some of the smaller landowners. And forestry as well tended to be perceived as a very permanent change and therefore requiring a really kind of fundamental decision on your land holding. And another sort of, technical aspect here, technical barrier, if you like, related to tenancies and the complexities of taking forward woodland schemes if you are an agricultural tenant. And the last one here really related to capacity and resourcing. Owner forestry knowledge tended to be limited within the sample. Although there were some examples of owners and managers who had quite high levels of knowledge, but as a result of that, there's a reliance generally on the expertise of forestry agents who play a really key role. There's also limited capacity for people to develop this, and farmers being quite busy in other areas, and also related to that, also recognition of limited wider forestry sector capacity, and some opportunities recognised there in relation to collaboration for efficiencies of scale or for developing sort of networks, stronger networks around woodland activity. And the third cross-cutting theme related to knowledge transfer and engagement, and generally limited forestry skills, limited development of woodland culture and experience, which can affect confidence for undertaking woodland creation, which is why this forestry consultant role is so critical to reducing financial risks and exploring viable options. We do play quite an important nudging role. But additionally to that, there's a role there, an important role for the additional advisors, whether that's the National Park or Scottish Forestry at local levels, who tend to be recognised as known or sometimes trusted contacts. And I should say that in general, the land managers and owners in the park viewed the National Park Woodland Advisor, valued the role of the existing National Park Woodland Advisor. And also recognition of opportunities there for enhancing owner experience through skills development or undertaking smaller woodland schemes and training and so on. So they're the four sort of overarching themes. Just a couple of kind of headline conclusions from those really. This idea that stages of change are evident, whether that's to do with climate change, markets, hill farming threats, and strong interest in trees, but also that's offset against ongoing uncertainty and hesitancy. The importance of recognising and using tipping points like succession or ownership change, and this idea of taking a first step and prioritising woodland creation at a time is really critical for increasing uptake and getting us past where people might value the idea but actually aren't actually putting it into place on the ground. Two strands of forestry activity clearly sort of evident. That's the sort of larger scale investment driven approach and also sort of smaller scale, what you might call more integrated on farm woodland type approach. And that's reinforced by current high levels of investment interest in forestry, but there may be some implications there in terms of the development of farm forestry culture. Important sort of overarching conclusion is that trusted intermediary and advisory roles and stable support mechanisms and clear sort of long-term policy direction are really important for managing risk and uncertainty and increasing uptake of woodland creation going forward. And there was some recommendations, and you can read through the detail of these in the report in your own time. They cover three sort of broad areas: reaching financial tipping points, that really relates to continuing the existing small grant scheme, but also exploring options for targeted grant support in the national park through some form of sort of locational supplement. Enhancing advice and local level guidance through financial support for options appraisals, which is now available in the national park, and also exploring options for increasing woodland officer capacity within the national park. And the last one there really relates to what we're doing now, but also potential for local level programme of engagement with land managers, so some knowledge transfer, and also facilitating information exchange around hot topics like carbon and developing some training. So I'll stop there and just thank everyone again for taking part in the research. And like I say, please keep your questions in mind. I'm going to stop screen sharing as well. I can go back to you down here. Where are we? I'm still screen sharing. I think I'm done. Where's my? Oh, there it is. Okay. And we can just keep, like I say, keep your questions in mind or post them in the thing. But I think we'll just carry on with the next talk for now, which is Tom Davies, who's going to talk to you about current guidance and support available for woodland creation. So over to you, Tom.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Okay, I've got a few slides to show, so I'll just bring those up and introduce myself. Great, okay, I hope you can see that clearly. Should be coming through for everyone. Good. Okay, well, hi everyone. Good to see you all. Good to see such a good turnout for this event this afternoon. As I said earlier on, my name is Tom Davis. I work for Scottish Forestry in the Perth and Argyll Conservancy, and I'm the senior ops manager in the Conservancy. I've been working in and around the national park for coming up for 18 years now. Firstly in Aberfoyle for quite some time, practicing forestry for FLS, or Forest Enterprise Scotland, as we were then, and then for about the last 10 years in regulation and development. So it's a great privilege to be working in and around the park for quite a substantial part of my career and seen a lot of changes and a lot of experience and knowledge of different parts of the park. Just want to give you a bit of information about just precisely who we are and what we do, Scottish Forestry. So this is a picture from our the website, and just to see the text on the right there. So we're an SG agency and we're responsible for policy, support and regulations. We were previously called Forestry Commission Scotland a few years ago, but we're now a separate agency. And I really work on the support and regulation side, and we have powers under two pieces of legislation just at the bottom here: the Forestry and Land Management Scotland Act 2018, which really governs tree felling, and then the EIA regulations, which is for woodland creation amongst two or three other forestry types. But for purposes today, we'll just talk about woodland creation. So those are our two regulatory. We have responsibilities under those two pieces of regulation, and we administer those on behalf of the Scottish Government. And we develop the industry, the forestry sector and the woodland sector through the Forestry Grant Scheme, helping to deliver SG aims and objectives. And it's worth saying at this point that we often get confused with Forestry and Land Scotland, who are called FLS. We are a totally separate agency. Forestry and Land Scotland manage the National Forest Estate, the publicly owned forests, of which there is a significant amount in the national park. But we are not the same. We are quite separate to FS. They are a different agency. So they manage the NFE, whereas we regulate and develop the whole sector, both public and private sector. Okay, I'll move on to my next slide. So yes, today's about woodland creation, and I really want to focus on support and guidance for woodland creation and talk about that. But I do just want to give a bit of wider context of what's been happening in the forestry and woodland world over the last 5 or 6 years. So as Rob said, SG has a real desire to see a lot of woodland creation, all around meeting internationally agreed climate change targets. And 10 years ago, when I started in the Conservancy, the target was 10,000 hectares a year, and no one ever thought we'd get anywhere near it. That was the accepted wisdom of the time. Yet, as you can see from this very basic chart in front of you, there has been a significant increase in woodland creation over the last 5 or 6 years. So going to the year at the bottom is the year 2016-17 right up to 2020 and 2021. As you can see, we've gone from sort of just between 4,000 and 5,000 hectares, creeping up to about 7, and then up to 11. It's certainly plateaued over the last 2 or 3 years, and there's been some reasons for that. Last year, particularly COVID, but certainly it's been a significant upsurge, and one might argue it's been the most significant increase of woodland creation that we've seen in the country for over a generation. It really has been transformative, and the current target for this year is 13,500 hectares, and that's going to be increasing to about 18,000 hectares by 24-25. And just to put that in some context, the area within the Edinburgh City bypass is about 11,000 hectares. So you can see what we've been delivering over the last few years for us as a regulator in approvals, and then the sector in actually delivering the schemes on the ground. And I think the forestry sector and woodland sector can be rightly proud of what's happened over the last 3 years, as everyone's been working very hard at every level to achieve that. And I did just want to show this slide because this is really quite an interesting comparison. And in this image and this graph, we see in the blue column what Scotland's been doing, and in the grey column what the UK, the 4 nations of the UK, have been doing as a whole. And you can see Scotland's been very much leading the way in delivering significant areas of new woodlands, and what's been happening in the rest of the UK has been much more restricted. It's interesting, I mean, I often say this to my team, but my 5 woodland officers across Perth and Argyll, between them, approved more woodland creation than England, Wales and Northern Ireland combined. So it just goes to show what kind of level of activity we've had just in Perth and Argyll, and that's replicated across much of the rest of the country. So it's really helpful just to see that wider context. And I just wanted to show that because this is not left field. It's very much a key element of what we're doing as an agency of Scottish Government, delivering and approving woodland creation schemes, which the sector, principally the private sector, is going out to deliver. And what is interesting is me as a forester, trained forester, when I get out of sort of my home office, wherever I happen to be, I spend very little of my time in the forest, actually. I spend most of my time on the open hill, which is the way things have been over the last few years, looking at areas that people want to change to woodlands. Okay, well, I now want to move on to support. And as I've been asked to do, is talk about support and guidance. And there's two things I want to talk about today in respect to support. First is the Forestry Grant Scheme, which we abbreviate to FGS. And secondly, just our network of staff, which Rob's referred to as well earlier on. So both these two things are the key support mechanisms that we have to support landowners, land managers, forestry agents as they look to create more woodland on their land. So let's talk about the Forestry Grant Scheme. So this is the front page of the Rural Payments and Services Forestry Grant Scheme page. The FGS is a discrete scheme within the wider Scottish Government Rural Support Scheme. And so we have this the Forestry Grant Scheme with a number of different options. The vast majority of the money that we spend on the forestry sector in Scotland, really, it goes into woodland creation. Very little goes into the management of existing woodlands, and there's some debates and discussions about the rights and wrongs of that. But where we are at the moment, most of it goes into the woodland creation. I don't expect you to read details on there. I wasn't showing you this slide to show you for you to read details, but you may note that midway down it talks about the SG target of 10,000 hectares. Well, that needs to be increased because it's currently 13.5. So moving on now. I was reluctant to show this slide, but I thought it's actually helpful because if you just bear with me, I'll explain it. I appreciate there's a lot of data on here, which is not easy to take in. But on the left-hand side, we've got the 9 different woodland creation options that we support. So we scheme on an option basis, and within which there's a number of different eligibility criteria. But there's 9 different options. And on the reading across the lines, you can see the different payment rates. So those are the payment rates that we pay for per hectare when you plant one of those options. So if you just focus with me on the native broadleaf option, which is about halfway down on the left-hand side, and then scan across on the row, you'll see an initial planting rate. The first line is £1,840 a hectare. So that's the capital payment we pay for a hectare of native broadleaves. And the second value is £272, and we pay that as the maintenance rate. And we pay that every year for 5 years. So the total payment rate per hectare is £3,200 a hectare. So if you come to me and say, Tom, I want to plant a hectare of native broadleaves, then I would be able to offer you £3,200 a hectare for one of those options. And you can see there's a range of different options there, and there's different payment rates. And you can go onto the website and look at all the options. I will just say one thing about these rates, because this is important, that the values, you can claim those rates, the capital, which is the £1,840 a hectare, upon completion of the work. So the process is you go through an application process, you get a contract to deliver the work, you deliver the work, and then you submit a claim. And then we would inspect it usually, and we would then approve the payment, all being well, of that £1,840 a hectare. And the annual maintenance, which is the second column, and for native broadleaves is £272 a hectare. You claim that on the SAF, annually on the SAF. That's the current arrangement, although it is likely that that will change, and you'll have the option to either claim it on the SAF or as a couple of payments throughout the 5-year period, like you do the capital claim. So you'll have the option, but it's currently claimed on the SAF, which has had some issues with payment because it seems to be paid quite a lot in the subsequent year, unfortunately, not the year it's claimed. So that's the process. I will just bring your attention, though, as you have noted along the top, we've got payment rates in standard areas, but we've also got payment rates in target areas. And so these are higher rates, uplifted rates that we can pay for the woodland creation options in certain geographical areas. And within the national park, there is an uplift. And Simon's going to be talking about the uplift later on, so I won't talk too much about it. But certainly, for certain options, principally the native options, you can get the uplifted rate where the woodland creation you propose is in what's called the preferred or potential areas in the strategy. Okay, I'm going to move on. So I've talked about the Forestry Grant Scheme. That's the principal mechanism of support through providing a grant, and it is a contribution. It's not expected to cover 100% of costs. It is a contribution to the creation of this woodlands based upon standard costs. The other way we support is through having a network of woodland officers and assistant woodland officers, and within the Loch, Lomond and Trossachs National Park area, and in fact the Cowal Peninsula, in those parts which aren't in the park, the woodland officer is a lady called Heather Fraser, so she can join us today, but she covers the park area and provides support and advice, and she's supported by an assistant woodland officer called Yvonne Hartley-Smith, who is in the meeting today, which is good to see Yvonne in the meeting. So that's our support staff, and they are very much on the ground, speaking to landowners, speaking to agents, assessing applications, and we can provide advice on forestry grant schemes, on forestry issues, on the management of existing woodlands, as well as woodland creation schemes. And I would encourage you, as I will come on to a bit later on, to speak to us, so in this case Heather or Yvonne, early on in the development of a scheme, so that we can be involved and engage in that. What we are not is a government agency that just receives an application late in the scheme and doesn't engage with it. You know, forestry is a land-based industry, and we want to be on the ground speaking to the people that are affected and involved in delivering it, so we can understand the objectives and help advise and guide that application so we get a successful and approved application. So please speak to the local staff when you've got a scheme to talk about. So I'm now going to move on to the second part, which is around guidance. I've talked about support, and I'll talk about guidance. There's plenty of written guidance, but I'm going to draw your attention to 3 documents. And these are the 3 key documents that you should have available to you. So firstly, the UK Forestry Standards, so government's approach to sustainable forestry. I appreciate this is a UK-wide document. There are some Scotland-specific things in it, but it does include quite a lot about woodland creation, and it's an important key document. We've got to ensure that everything that we approve as a regulator is sustainable, and that is utterly fundamental to what we do. And this is the UK-wide approach to sustainable forest management. The second thing is the woodland creation application guidance, and this and I'm going to show this in a bit more detail in a moment. But this came about in like sort of 3 or 4 years ago, really to standardise the approach across the country of how all the different conservancies assess woodland creation schemes, whether you're in the south or north, east or west of the country, and also gives clear guidance to an applicant what the applicant needs to do. And that's a really helpful guide. And the third key document is this, which Simon's going to be talking about, is the trees and woodland strategy. And these 3 documents are the key things to inform and understand, to inform decision making on woodland creation, and understand what we'll be looking for as a regulator and what we expect to see. Okay, now let's want to look in detail at the woodland creation applicants guidance. So on the left here, I've got, I think, the key page in that whole document, which talks through the process. And I appreciate there's quite a few lines and boxes, and it's not easy to pick this up when you've seen it for the first time. But if you do, you can get that document online, download it, print it if you want to. And this is the key page that you need to look at. And it splits out what we call applicant-led activity. So if you're an applicant, you want to apply for woodland creation on your ground or your client's ground, you do the bits in blue. And we were FSCS when this was published, but now Scottish Forestry, we do the bits in yellow. So it sets out the different roles and responsibilities and what people need to do. And I do just want to focus specifically on 1.2, because this is the absolute key part of the process. And this is it, 1.2, the due diligence. And there's four sections to this. And if you get this right, then the application should be much easier and much smoother through the process. And so this is the key part of this. So data gathering and site assessment, engaging Scottish Forestry, sorry, that's not been changed, UKFS compliance, and engaging with consultees and neighbours. And I'll just make a quick comment on each one before I come to a finish. So data gathering and assessment talks about site assessment, the kind of site surveys that need to be undertaken. It might be a breeding bird survey, for example, an archaeological survey, a vegetation survey, a deep peat survey. These are all very common things that need to be undertaken to assess the sensitivities and constraints of the lands that you have. Engaging us, as I said earlier on, please do talk to us at an early stage, because we can provide advice on the kind of surveys that you may need to do, which we'd expect to see. And that's really important, because particularly breeding birds, there's a seasonality, and you miss a season, it can delay the whole application by a year, which would be very disappointing. So do talk to us at an early stage, engage us, we'll meet with you and aim to come out and visit the site when we can. We can't do things immediately because we are busy, but we will get it in the diary, and it may be 6 weeks perhaps before we can visit the site, but we do want to look at it with the applicant. Top right is UKFS compliance. Again, I won't go into that too much detail, but sustainability we're looking for, and understanding the species composition, ensuring there's no negative impacts on the environment. And the last one on the bottom right there, engaging with consultees and neighbours. So speak to your neighbours and engage with consultees, such as obviously the National Park, Nature Scot, SEPA, Community Council, a local authority, which in the park really only relates to timber transport. So getting this stage right, the due diligence, is a really important part of the process, and my team will help advise you on that. I get very involved in advice as well, but getting that stage right will really help smooth the process through. Okay, well, that really brings to an end what I wanted to say. I hope I've not bamboozled people with too much information, but just talking about wider context, support and guidance, and happy to take any questions at the end. Equally happy to answer anything via email at a later stage if people have questions we don't have time for today. Okay, Rob, I'm back to you.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Tom. Very helpful. I think we're going to just move along to Simon. Simon Franks from the National Park.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. I'll just bring up my presentation here.
Yeah, perfect.
Right, thank you everyone, and thank you, Tom, for setting the scene for this. Just by way of a wee bit more of introduction, I've been working as a Trees and Woodlands advisor for the National Park for the last 7.5 years. Prior to that, working for private sector forestry companies and various NGOs, and some of that work was within the park as well. So yeah, seen the park in a number of different guises. Just I think this woodland creation context been pretty well covered by Rob, but I think again worth highlighting that we are approximately 31% cover with woodland in the park, and 23% of that is native woodland. To put a bit of spatial context on this, this shows a map of the national park with the native woodland in brown and the productive conifer in green. It's worth stating this is from the most up-to-date information from a year or two ago. So it does include areas of new woodland that's been created since the park was created in the early 2000s. So new woodlands that cross in the west of the park around Loch and Invernoden, and also large increase in native woodland as through the Great Trossachs Forest project around Loch, and smaller schemes in Glendocket in the north of the park as well. So as Tom's already said, the park have a trees and woodland strategy. This is effectively what might also be known as the indicative forestry framework, or a forest strategy, which all other local authorities had within the park. We've picked out trees purely to relate to the importance of non-woodland trees in other areas of the national park, as well as obviously recognising the large extent of woodland that we have. The previous strategy dated from 2004, so 2 or 3 years ago it was realised this needed to be updated, and we went through an extensive process of stakeholder consultation to develop both the consultation version and the final version. So these were workshops in 2018 to develop the strategy, and then a online consultation for the version that was finally approved and launched in January 2020. It's an unusual document. Well, the forestry strategies are created by a local authority, but they are obviously, as Tom said, used by Scottish Forestry as a regulator to assess proposals. So obviously a lot of close working with Tom and his colleagues on the development of the strategy. We have a vision that is intended to capture the kind of diverse woodland portfolio that we have within the park, recognising there's strong biodiversity desires, but also recognising the large amount of productive conifer that there is, and then the other benefits that woodlands and forests bring. We have 7 strategic objectives. So obviously the initial one is to increase woodland cover, and recognising the large extent of existing woodland, improving the condition and the diversification of the management of the existing woodland. See, within the national park, protecting and enhancing the landscape is a key factor to be considered in these things. Maintaining and enhancing the economic sustainability of forestry through the skills and businesses that it can develop. It also a key opportunity for sustainable local industry and employment. Working to try and develop cooperative woodland management and creation as part of the integrated land management approach. The park, for those who aren't aware, is one of the trial areas for the Rural Land Use Partnership. So this was trying to lead ourselves into that process that's now starting to be developed. So community empowerment and resilience, woodlands can help with that. And then obviously the recreation side as well. They've got a lot of recreation, mainly in the Forestry and Land Scotland, woodlands around Aberfoyle, and also in the west of the park around Glenbranter and Loch, provide a large infrastructure for recreation. So the strategy then divides into management of existing woodlands, which I'm not going to touch on any further in this presentation, because obviously it's more about the woodland creation side. So we'll move on to the woodland creation areas. Obviously recognise that despite the extent of woodland, there are still opportunities for sensitively designed and located new native and productive woodlands to be developed within the park. One of the things that we developed, so we had two approaches to looking at how we could help agents and landowners look at what capacity there is for woodland. One is a landscape capacity study that I'll come on to later in the talk, and the other opportunity mapping we undertook was to do with native woodland creation. So this was a GIS-based approach to look at where native woodlands would grow and also enhance connectivity. So it's worth saying that this hasn't taken into account constraints, so it still doesn't remove the need to do some of the due diligence surveys that Tom alluded to, but it indicates areas where a fairly high level woodland creation would be supported. The preferred and potential areas shown here in green and brown are what are the target areas that Tom referred to in his presentation, which would attract the target payment. There's a few areas that have been highlighted as sensitive, which means we've felt there's limited opportunities for woodland creation, and these are due to higher value nature conservation designations in those, or species that are found there, or landscape constraints. So areas where there may be design landscapes or strong wader interests are the predominant reasons, or there are a couple of designated sites for geology, and are the main reasons for the red areas. Now I want to move on to the landscape capacity study that was commissioned. So this used a landscape architect to assess the national park, which and the capacity for the existing landscape to take, should we say, to take additional woodland. This divided the park into 7 zones, and those further divided into 31 subzones. Sorry, 31 subzones. And each of these subzones was then assessed for its landscape capacity, either for new native woodland or new productive conifer woodland. This approach has also been used in other areas. I believe it's used in the borders to help with some of their refinement of the forest strategy down there. So as you can see here, it provides an initial assessment of where woodland would fit within the existing landscape. These assessments were only taken using relatively few viewpoints, so there is a need to kind of double check this if maybe an area you're looking at may not be obvious from the viewpoints used. There may need to be some further review of this, but this is where myself or Scottish Forestry can happily help provide that advice at an early stage. In general, the capacity of medium or greater would be where productive conifer would be favoured. This accompanied by other factors such as existing extraction infrastructure, extension areas where it would increase woodland habitat connectivity, and diversification of the land holdings. So then the strategy goes on to talk about 5 key themes to help the development of proposals. This guidance is all based on national policies and standards, and really highlights the key issues and opportunities that there are within the park. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but they kind of go into the landscape, the habitat enhancements, and then the integration with other land uses, social and rural development, and then woodlands and people. I just want to say that obviously we do have hard copies of the strategy that are available, but over the last year and a half, it's obviously been very tricky to get those out. So we do have a lot of information online, and the link here provides that information. We also have the information available on an interactive browser as well that can also be downloaded onto desktop GIS systems just to help with any analysis. But if anyone is wanting hard copies, we can arrange to get those out to you. And finally, the park are looking at ways to maybe support woodland creation. So this year we've launched what we've called a woodland creation planning fund, and this is to maybe help contribute towards surveys that may be needed in some of that due diligence process to help design woodlands, and also as part of other proactive land management. There are some key areas where we're directly engaging with landowners about seeing if there's opportunities for woodland creation there. So that's the end of the presentation. But again, if there's any questions or queries, more than happy to take them now, or shall I hand back to Rob?
Okay. Yeah, do make a note of your questions, and we will come back to that over the next presentation. So I think we'll just keep going on. Thanks, Simon, for that. And I'll pass over to Andrew Vaughan from Tail Hill.
Okay, thank you, Rob.
Thanks, Andrew.
I'll just share my screen. Seems to have frozen. Give it a minute.
So if anybody does have a question at this point, by all means shout it out. But that's the other little technical day. If anyone has a burning issue, or put it into the chat feed before. Oh yeah, Bella, please do go ahead.
Hi, I'm not going to turn my video on because
No problem.
I have the worst internet connection in Britain. I wonder if there's any information available or any funding available or anything like that on the montane scrub aspect of woodland, and whether that is something that is encouraged. What are the thoughts? What's been the research? That kind of thing. That's
Tom,
it.
do you want to come in on that, Tom? Or anyone else? Oh.
Yeah, I can just make a comment on that. We don't have a specific option for montane scrub. The closest we get is the low density native option, which is for upper tree line woodlands, principally around creating prey habitat, which may be suitable for golden eagle, but we don't have a specific option for montane scrub. Certainly it's there's other places which have been focusing on it. I think particularly of the National Trust NTS up at Ptarmigan and it's north of Culin, but we don't have an option as part of it. However, we're always interested to see what people might come up with in a proposal, and if they've got something which they want to submit in it, as long as it fits into one of the current options, we're happy to discuss it. I think the challenge, of course, is ensuring, because we're investing public money, is ensuring that we're going to get a woodland delivered at the end of that, and that's the challenge. And we need to safeguard the public investment, so that's where some of these things become a bit more challenging.
Bella, there is also some information I can, if you send me your email address, there is, I think it's called Scrubbers. There is some information that's been published more about the practicalities of establishing that upper tree line. And yeah, it's certainly something that within the park we're keen to see, but quite often maybe actually managing the herbivores to enable more natural succession is a lower risk approach, because as Tom says, it's a tricky area to grant aid just because of the altitudes involved. But yeah, more than happy to send some further information on to you about that.
Perfect. Thanks for that, both. And Andrew has got his presentation up now, so I think do save your questions and we'll come back to them at the end of this one. Okay, over to you, Andrew. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. I had a bit of a wobble there as a team, or it seemed to sort of not fire up. Anyway, it's going now, thankfully. So, well, good afternoon, everybody. I was invited to speak today on our involvement or my experience of working in the national park, and I thought I'd use a case study on Carrick Estate at Loch for my presentation, which is entitled "Woodlands for Conservation, Carbon and Capital." Just to recap, I'm the regional manager for Till Hill. I'm responsible for all our teams. I've got a team of 36 staff working north of the Central Belt, and of the team of 30 forest managers, 8 of them are active in the national park or in Cowell area. So it's obviously a lot of forestry there, so therefore, you know, you'd expect us to be busy there, and sure enough we are. Just to express or explain a bit about the estate, you can see in the left-hand map there that Carrick Estate is on the southwest corner of the national park. It occupies the land between the shore of Loch Goil to the west of Loch Goil, over the watershed down to Invernoden and by Loch. So it's a 7,000 acre estate. And the map on the right, the aerial photo, shows the area demarcated by the green line of the areas of woodland creation that we've done over the past few years. So we've done some significant area of woodland creation, and it's been an interesting journey so far. And I thought, even if you're contemplating planting smaller areas of woodland, and bearing in mind the average area that's grant aided is 26 hectares, so they generally are smaller. There are some lessons that I think will be applicable to you. So just to explain a bit about the timeline here, we were asked by the original owner of the property to investigate woodland creation. I think at that point he was scunnered with sheep. I don't think he had any succession kind of allowed for, and therefore he wanted an exit strategy. So we started to look at the options for woodland creation. And at that point, because of the scale and potential of the site, we did this through an environmental impact assessment. And it so happened that that very year, the sheep had been taken off, and for the first time in 40 years, a pair of golden eagles returned to the estate. So that was an added complication that no one had expected. And we were then looking at investigating how we could incorporate a woodland design around the needs of the golden eagle, also the issues of landscape and also deer management. And as we came through the end of this process and we were moving towards a grant contract, the property was then sold and was bought by the current owner. And he bought the estate basically with an environmental bent. That's what his interest was. So this was kind of right up his street. And we started the planting in 2014 by planting the first sort of phase of about 500 hectares, mainly with conifers with some broadleaves. And then we then finished off the grant approved area and a further sort of 100 hectares of woodland creation, phase 2, which is mainly broadleaves with some conifers. But also we did a felling and restocking as well. So there's another 100 hectares there, give or take. And in 2017, we did a further smaller new native woodland creation scheme at Glenfinnet on the west side of the estate. Another one at Corrie Yolt in 2020, and we've got a further one due this coming winter at Corrie Yoden above Invernoden. So in total, over this period, the estate will have planted something like 929 hectares, which is pretty incredible, given we're in the national park, I think. And thinking about the benefits that will come from this, this is a slide taken from COMFOR. And the benefit of woodland, obviously you're creating a capital asset which will grow, but the main benefit is that when we process timber, most of the processing happens in Scotland, so we add value in Scotland, and that isn't actually the case, certainly with sheep farming. Most of the value is added outside Scotland, but trees grow, they soak up carbon, and they create jobs and they create prospects there for the economy. But also places for wildlife and places to roam and recreation, and also increasingly with climate change, that with the perception is woodlands will reduce flood risk to downstream communities. And in the context of an owner and what their objectives might be, I think this is an interesting slide I'm sharing with you. This is done from a PhD that Vanessa Burton has done at Edinburgh University. So basically, to explain this to you, that if you think about possible objectives, these might range from a single purpose across to multi-purpose objectives, or from sort of utility, sort of public benefits to maybe one or two benefits. And this, so the right-hand side is conservation, perhaps narrow sort of benefits, all across far to the left of sort of multi-public benefits, or high utility. And therefore, any woodland, or even a part of a woodland, could be considered to fall somewhere in these sort of graphs. Your timber production is perhaps single purpose, but has higher public utility with the economic benefits. Similarly, societal benefits from recreational woodlands, perhaps more multi-purpose, as are ecosystem services, whereas woodlands designed purely for conservation would perhaps be more single purpose and have a less public utility. And I'll come back to this graph in a moment and explain kind of how the woodlands on Carrick fit into this. But for many people, woodlands and trees, not only do you have the sort of three-dimensional habitat of the forest, but you also have the benefits of the flora and fauna. And there's obviously, Scotland has only so many natural heritage assets, and really it's the role of the industry and society to help protect these and enhance them where possible. And forestry and woodlands, sometimes it gets a bad press, but actually we do an awful lot to manage these assets, and we're very proud of our record, and certainly want to keep improving doing what we do. And woodland creation creates a big opportunity to change land use and start thinking about slower land management and sort of methods of land management which are more favourable to sort of heritage assets. Another concept which get you thinking, I've pinched these graphs from George Peterkin, who's a very famous ecologist, UK ecologist, and he did some work on the Clyde Valley, and he was looking at where to predict woodland expansion, where it should best happen to sort of benefit the Clyde Valley. If you look at the left-hand most box there, if you have a landscape with a random 10% cover of blacks, blobs, or in this case, well, let's say woodland, you can see there's very little on zero connectivity. There's very little core area. And even if we increase to 30% cover, the core areas are small, they're isolated still. There is some connectivity, but it's not particularly great. And it's only when you get towards 50% cover that the core areas start to grow in scale and be more valuable. And if you have specialist species that require core areas, then you're moving into more favorable sort of habitat for them. But it's only really when you get to 60% cover that you've got really strong core areas and really good influential networks, that you have connections between the two. So what I'm pointing out here is that in the national park, already the landscape will probably be close to the 60% in terms of natural habitats. So you'll have forests, you'll have native woodlands, you'll have unimproved habitats, you'll have watercourses, you'll have the high ground, the tops of the mountains and so on, semi-natural habitats, which are giving us a really exceptional integrated habitat network. But there's much more we can do to improve that. And Simon's sort of diagram of looking at woodland expansion, that is going to add to this and sort of secure these, and that is really important for climate change, to allow our heritage assets to cope with the pressure that they're going to come under in the next 20 years or so. So talking about Carrick, the largest planting we did was 700 hectares on Carrick Farm, and obviously that is dominated by productive species, Sitka spruce, but some pine as well, with broadleaves. And that would basically fall in this area, in the green gold area, but we're still producing societal benefits. We design walks in there, we've got tracks and paths and so on. There is a native component to it, so there is an element of wildwood to it, but we're still producing these native ecosystem services from native networks. The other three woodlands we've planted, Glenfinnet is to the southwest corner of the estate, so it's out with it's on the west side, away from Loch, above Loch. That also has some productive conifers, but it's very popular with walkers, and there's a connecting route that goes right through Glenfinnet and into the estate. The other two woodlands, Corrie Yolt and Corrie Yoden, are above Invernoden, above Loch, and they're not really connected and available for public access, but they're native. There's the high native component there, so they're much more bespoke and perhaps single purpose in looking at carbon sequestration and nativeness. So that's where they would fall on these graphs. And to explain a bit about the challenges we faced, first of all, the golden eagles appeared. That literally created havoc, because we'd already were working on quite an intricate design, and that initial design was about having more diversity, mixed broadleaves at the base of the hill where they're visible, and having the conifers higher up the hill where they're less visible and they can cope with the terrain and the environment. But because of the eagle, we kind of had to turn it on its head. We had to have more mixture higher up, and we had the conifers lower down. So that also led to a review of golden eagle terrain and habitat and the policy on that. And it has also since moved on. There's a new sort of model on golden eagles. So that is developing all the time. But the main thing I wish to point out is that when we started planting back in 2014, we have no deer fencing around what we planted. That was for environmental reasons and to protect the bird life that's there. So we've achieved 700 hectares of woodland creation without fencing, and I must say it's been blinking hard work. We have ongoing deer pressure from the north, south, and the west. There is no active deer management group in Cowell, so we have quite poor collaboration with neighbours, and we're just chipping away, trying to work away at the deer. And you can see from the two photos there on the right, we're getting there. The trees are coming. There's a lot of natural regeneration of broadleaves too, and I think we're creating what will be an exceptional landscape. But the soils are very variable. They're quite peaty. The climate is very wet, and we're planting up to 550 meters altitude, which is pretty high and exposed. So it's challenging for the trees. And we are challenged by access. We have blocks on the west side of the estate, but we don't have any access to that. So we have to literally go over the top of the hill to get to them. And therefore controlling deer, imagine if there was a walker had an accident on that west side of the estate and you needed the mountain rescue to go and drag that person out, say weighing 70 kilos, about the weight of a dead red deer, you'd have a dozen people to pull that person, the accident victim, out. Whereas if you shoot a deer and you're on your own, you've got to take that out by yourself with very poor access. So you can imagine just how hard that is. Also, we are limited by the eagle territory. We are not allowed to disturb them through certain parts of the year. So it's a significant part of the area of the estate and the area we've planted. We are very limited in what we can do and when, so we have to be careful there. And as we are developing the woodland and it's growing on, we have to make sure that the trees, the nutrition's good, and we're also seeing little pockets of heather check. So we're going to have to deal with that with weed control to make sure that the woodland establishes properly. And COVID has been an added distraction, particularly with our deer management. The venison market has crashed in that time. So we've went from getting £2.80 a kilo for the venison down to £1 a kilo, and even then we're lucky to move it at all. And also, our interaction with Forest and Land Scotland, we're trying to enhance that and improve that, so we're kind of on the same page with our deer control, and that hasn't been particularly easy. But you can see from the photo we're getting there. And the outcomes to the estate, well, basically, the owner, we're aiming for 500 hectares of productive conifer forest above Carrick, overlooking Loch Goyle, with a fringe of native broadleaves up along the top, and it's kind of interlocking with all the rocky outcrops there. And I think it's going to be a fantastic landscape in years to come. It will provide an ecological asset of at least 450 hectares of native woodland, with all the ecosystem benefits from that. The estate has a wedding venue and tourism, ecotourism destination, so they're looking at promoting the recreational resource. The owner is fascinated by carbon sequestration, and that's been a key driver and continues to be going forwards. And we have the potential, you can see in the photos on the right there, so the top one was 2014, taken in one of the glens on the estate, and that's what it's looking at now, 6 years later. So we will get much more woodland creation just by natural regeneration. So it's not grant funded, this is just extra areas that are coming in purely because we've taken the grazing off and we're controlling the deer. And that has to be, to the benefit, for society, for rewilding. Tom has mentioned about the Forestry Grant Scheme application process. So I thought I'd just highlight some of the key elements of that. This was changed sort of 4 or 5 years ago. So if you're thinking about woodlands and you want to plant, have a careful think about what are your objectives, what you're aiming to achieve. You'll then enter the process of due diligence, basically to sense check what you're seeking to achieve and what the issues are on the site. You'll consult over those issues, and you record that consultation in an issues log, which will detail how you're dealing with the issues and constraints. And once you've getting towards the end of that process, you would then approach Scottish Forestry, who would then review the application against the UK Forest Standard, and of course it has to be compliant with that. And once they're satisfied that that is the case, you're then moving towards the end of the contract. It goes on the public register for 28 days, and once it comes off, then the contract is issued and you're good to go. So that's a bit about the process. I think it's probably a bit daunting if you've never done this sort of thing before, but it is logical, but you do need to kind of know a fair bit about the technical aspects of woodlands and woodland creation. So I dare say if you're looking at this yourself, you probably would need some sort of professional help. Another more interesting thing as well, I think, recently has been carbon. We, in Till Hill, we've developed our own carbon emissions model. So we have a spreadsheet that will predict the year to net zero for any woodland creation site we're working on. And the beauty of this is not necessarily to provide us with an absolute figure of when we're going to get to net zero, but what it allows us to do is to compare different options. So if you want to fence, or do you want to use plastic tubes? Well, what's the difference in carbon life cycle, and when will you get to net zero? And with this model, we're now able to interrogate, an owner's objectives and options, and try and predict the best way forward to minimise, carbon release. And my final advice to you all is, if you are thinking about woodland creation, be clear on what your aims and objectives are. What are you trying to achieve with what you're wanting to plant? Be sympathetic to existing natural heritage assets. The worry for me is that farmers will want to plant all the bits of ground which are unproductive for their farming, but those are the very areas that have the best heritage assets, such as the wetlands and marginal pieces of ground and areas that are undeveloped or undermanaged. That's really where the wildlife assets enjoy living. So we've got to be careful that we don't damage those. You've also got to be careful. We have to address the key constraints of the site and make sure that you're favouring the tree growth. And therefore, if you get the design right, the trees will grow and you should have no problems. If you get it wrong and you cut corners, then you are going to have issues getting your trees established. And in my experience, I mean, I've planted 40 million trees in my career for hundreds of clients. I've been doing this for 35 years. Where schemes go wrong is normally because maintenance program is not followed. It falls apart. The owner's getting maintenance grants and he thinks, well, I'll just pocket some of that money. I'm not going to pay for maintenance this year. That is a huge mistake. The trees, they do need weeding. You need to do replacement planting, and you do need to do the deer control, etc., through the early years. And if you get that right, within 3 to 4 years, your woodland is established. You get it wrong, and you're going to have problems, and you're then going to have to contend with dealing with Scottish Forestry, who quite rightly are going to come back and look at this and start questioning. And I'd also ask you, if you are doing it, just review progress annually. Is it achieving what you set out to achieve? Maybe things will change because of the circumstances, but is the woodland going in the right direction? And be honest with yourself. If it's not, you need to spend the maintenance money. And it's interesting. We have 300 clients that Till Hill deal with, and all of the investors we deal with, they're quite commercial, quite hard-nosed, but it's amazing. I would say over half of them start off thinking about the pounds, shillings and pence, and within a matter of time, then all they care about is the environment and the benefits that their properties are bringing. They then realise that the journey is far more enjoyable than they ever thought, and that's certainly what I'd recommend to you. Is enjoy the journey as you create your woodland and it establishes. And that's me. Thank you.
Great, it's great. Thank you for that, Andrew. And so I think what we'll do at this point, then I can see that Simon, you've got your hand up there as well, so you can maybe kick off the discussion, and then I just open the floor to everyone else as well. And if you have questions, just raise your hand, and we will get to you in turn. Simon, I'll maybe pass over to you.
Yeah, sorry for jumping in there. I just had a question for Andrew about obviously the decision at Carrick not to fence. Realised given where it was obviously a very quite a significant decision to make. Looking at where you are now, would you say that the cost of the fencing overall has there been any difference in maybe the cash flow comparing, I don't know how many kilometers of fencing against the effort of deer control? It'd just be interesting just to know, and yeah, just an idea of how that balance has worked out financially, really, maybe.
Well, the grant aid for fencing, well, as probably people are aware, with Brexit and COVID and the impact on timber markets, the cost of fencing has rocketed. So currently, the fence cost is substantially higher than the grant. But the principle of avoiding fencing is sensible, because the Scottish Forestry have spent £30 million on deer fencing for woodland creation. So that's an awful lot of money. That could achieve an awful lot of planting. But the problem is, it's the owner who's taking on the risk. He's signing a contract to guarantee he's going to establish the forest that he's designed, and the pressure we have from deer is horrendous. I have one property. We have shot 2,000 deer in 3 years, and there's a wall of deer that just keep coming, and we're shooting that number just to keep the damage levels to what we need to stop our trees being damaged. So. Yes, would I do it again, Simon? I don't know. I'll be honest, there are parts of the estate that are struggling to establish, and those are the bits up in the high ground in the eagle territory where we can't get into doing the maintenance because we're always hitting the eagle sort of breeding season. But there is regeneration coming, and when Scottish Forestry get out to site and do their site inspection, I hope they're going to have take a reasonable approach on that, because our hands have been tied, and we haven't been able to get in there to shoot the deer in that part of the estate just because we're not allowed to. So anyway, time, trees will come with time. So even if you don't fence, as long as you're doing some control and trying to manage the level of browse, trees will develop if they're given the chance.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Can I also add, Simon, an interesting point, and Rob, that you mentioned, which there's a new strain of investor coming through, and these are environmental investors. These are new people who are not necessarily interested in timber or timber production. They're interested in carbon, and they're very much looking at the environment and the social benefits and so on. And there's a huge surge of these type of people about to come into the industry. I think this is really interesting, and these type of investors would not be scared off by coming into the national park, unlike say a commercial investor. So I think that there are prospects there for a new style of landowner to come in.
No, I think Rob's research was kind of very much probably informed by the 2 years ago, and I think we have seen in the last 6 months to years some very interesting changes in that. So yeah, no, it'll be very, very interesting to see how this progresses. Definitely. Thank you.
Yeah. And carbon's been quite a rapidly moving thing as well. I think we're probably fair to say that it's a lot's happened in the last couple of years. Can I just see? Does anybody else want to kick off with a question to any of the panel members? Quite a quiet group. I mean, I can maybe pose one if you like, but I'm just anybody else for. I was just going to ask. I guess I'm not sure what it's for exactly, but just about the small-scale woodlands aspect and the kind of markets for that, because that is something that comes up a lot, and you see that across kind of not just in the national park, but more generally as well. What people think about the potential for making money from a smaller scale woodland in more of like a sort of a farm context, whether that's from a kind of biomass wood fuel side of things or now from the carbon side of things, whether generally people on the panelists think that that's improved or not. Are we, is it still quite a difficult thing to...
Rob, we had an interesting potential client come up from Wales. He'd sold his landholding in Wales and he ran the firewood business down there, and he was looking at buying. He literally is seeking to buy a property in the national park to run a firewood business. There's a massive potential there, and yeah, he gets it, and he's already run a successful business doing that, and he thinks there's potential there. So I think small scale woodlands are tricky at times, but I think the problem is you have the gap between when you plant it and when you start producing wood. It's a long period, and therefore if landowners aren't encouraged to take that risk and go for that 20-year period when nothing's happening, but if you take that plunge and get 20 years in, then all of a sudden they'll realize the benefits that otherwise they wouldn't ever enjoy. So not without its risks.
I mean, one of the things I'm kind of struck by quite a lot is the amount of smaller bits of woodland which are effectively kind of undermanaged, particularly on farms, I suppose. And some of that seems to stem from the idea that, well, you don't have the time, but also there's no point because you won't make any money from it anyway in terms of an output. Although, and I know the wood fuel thing has changed a bit, but maybe not that drastically for those sorts of woodlands. And I know, Simon, you mentioned that's kind of the other question in your mind sometimes is, it's like, how do we create new woodlands? But actually, we've got quite a lot of woodlands as well that we're not necessarily managing some of the times, particularly at the smaller scale end of things, I suppose. Some of which are maybe doing fine in their own right anyway, but some clearly could do with a bit of management.
I think there's definitely potential for some areas in the park where you have 10, 20, 30 hectare predominantly maybe native woodlands that could have some degree of management to bring products out, but it's kind of, I think there's a bit of a skill gap there really. There's even just maybe even on the mechanized side, just getting smaller harvesters for thinning's quite tricky, I think. So even getting people who can do hand felling and that side of stuff, there is definitely, I think, a skill gap there for managing these smaller woodlands. And yeah, and kind of just seeing that culture of actually a positive benefit in managing the woodlands, something that we would, I mean, one of the presentations we did as part of the trees and woodland strategy with a group called Woodlots that are kind of looking to provide people with skills, but no woodland, and match them with people who have woodland, but maybe not the time or the skills. So you end up with a bit of a lease arrangement and woodland gets managed that way. So I think there's not many in this area. I think there might be one being developed over near Crieff and some in the borders, but yeah, opportunities for different ways to try and maybe get the more management of these smaller woodlands coming forward is definitely there.
And the other thing as well that, like, I didn't really mention it in my results, but it was kind of mentioned the bits and pieces here and there, is agroforestry. And agroforestry seems to get mentioned all the time. There's various projects in agroforestry, and there's like research being done in agroforestry, but it doesn't really seem to be happening on the ground in any like real scale. Is that your experience of it as well? And do you want to share anything on why you think that's happening, or whether it is likely to change in the future? I'm not sure where Scottish Forestry are at the moment in relation to agroforestry, but just, yeah, I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that, because you hear a lot about it, but it doesn't seem to be loads of it around.
Who's that question to?
Well, anybody that wants to sort of answer it, really, I suppose.
Well, I'm on the customer reps group for the forestry grant scheme, as is Tom, and we had a meeting at the end of August, and this was raised there that there is pressure for agroforestry, but no one seems to know exactly what it means. But basically, it's integrating land management for trees, tree growth, and agricultural production. And I know there's SEC and SRUC have done work in their hill station at Kirkton there. I've never seen it done successfully though. So, because usually they're mutually exclusive, and you have trees, you put livestock into trees, they'll damage the trees. So unless you do it very carefully, of course. But yeah, I'm sure there is potential there, and the further research is looking to be addressed through the customer reps group. We have a volunteer who's looking at this, and it was we'll follow this up, and over the next few months, hopefully we'll hear more about it.
Tom was going to come in there, and I see a question from David as well, which we'll come to after that. Tom.
Yeah, I'll just say we do have an option in the grant scheme for agroforestry, but I can't think of a single application that we've received in Perth and Argyll Conservancy, unfortunately. It seems to be something that people aren't following up. And I think one of the things we'll have to do when we look at the grant scheme going forward is and understand why is the option correct? Is there a demand for something else? But it's certainly people are talking about it. I think, just pick up on what Andrew said, there's some confusion about what agroforestry is, and sometimes what people perceive to be agroforestry are small farm woodlands, and we have quite a favourable option financially for small farm woodlands, different to what I think traditional agroforestry is, that very close integration of livestock and trees. But happy to receive any applications if people want to pursue it, and happy to talk to us about it. We'll see if we can fit it into the grant option.
Can I throw a question out to the sort of floor here about natural regeneration? Because the way, what's forecast is that the subsidy on sheep is going to reduce. So therefore, we're already seeing sheep numbers falling in other parts of Scotland. Will that be the same in the national park? And therefore, are we going to see less grazing and therefore more potential for natural regeneration and expansion of woodlands that way? What do people think, the people on this call?
That was definitely referred to by interviewees, just and yeah, quite funnily sometimes, because it was more a case of we're getting natural regeneration whether we want it or not, and a few of them didn't want it, but didn't see that there was a lot they could do about it once it had got established. So if you're a hardcore sheep farmer, it's kind of seen as a bit of an invader, I think. Does anybody else have any observations on that or thoughts?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah. Go ahead, Tim.
I just wondered, is there any obligation on the part of anybody who plants Sitka, in say 20 hectares of Sitka, of controlling the spread of Sitka elsewhere?
Andrew, I don't know if you're waiting for me or I'm waiting for you on that one.
I'll let you go. You can answer that. So you're the regulator.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's something that we discuss internally from time to time, because we do see this. Obviously, Sitka's been planted in Scotland for 50, 60 years, and particular focus in the last 30 to 40 years of the large-scale afforestation of Sitka spruce. It's a non-native species. It's a naturalized species, but it's a non-native species, and it can regenerate given in the right kind of conditions. I think a couple of things I would say. Firstly, that the majority of Sitka spruce is harvested before there's prolific seed. You might get periods of seeding, some years where there is some seed, but a lot of it will be harvested before it's 45 years old. Some of it younger than that. So just by planting Sitka doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be there in perpetuity. It's when restructuring takes place, there is generally less commercial conifer and an increase in open space broadleaves and diverse conifers. So there isn't necessarily that level of Sitka going forward. There are some areas of regeneration, and some of those areas actually, some might argue, are quite beneficial. If there's low density woodland, they could be beneficial for black grouse if they create a very gradual upper edge. However, it can cause problems, particularly on sensitive habitats, designated sites, native woodlands. It is an issue, and it's something which we as a regulator doesn't necessarily come into focus tremendously, except when we're dealing with designated sites. So if there's a triple SI, we provide funding to help remove non-native species which would be affecting the feature for which the triple SI is designated, so to bring it into a more favourable ecological condition. Andrew, I'm interested to know your thoughts on this regarding certification and the requirement for open ground. So that may be something you could comment upon, particularly for Sitka plantations.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, most of the forests we manage are certified under the UK Woodland Insurance standard, which is a higher level of sort of standard than the UK Forest standard. There's more sort of focus on the environmental. A key part of that is that you every 5 years, when you renew your plan, you're audited, and the auditor will come in and ask lots of awkward questions about, say, your waste removal strategy, your chemical minimization strategy, and also how are you managing the native areas and the designated areas. So I think it's very rare for a Sitka spruce forest not to be certified, and that hopefully gives some level of credibility to the manager, the forest manager, having his feet held to the fire to make sure that we're managing things properly. But I guess the issue is if trees and seedlings are leaking into adjacent neighbouring property, particularly if it's designated, then that probably is definitely an issue. But I do know that, you know, and you know, having dealt with Tom on a couple of recent woodland creation examples where we've been planting adjacent to SSSI woodlands, we've had to use a buffer of either open space and/or native species to make sure that non-native species are kept away, and we're not going to be dropping seed in over the boundary fence. But yes, I think it is an issue, you know, and it's one that I think the industry we have to wake up to and take on the head, and hopefully, you know, as we go forward with our UCWAS and we are audited, that we will be held to account for that, and we'll actually come up with a solution.
Simon, I can see you. I think you're going to come in now, are you? Or is there no hand?
Yeah, no, I think it's just to kind of echo. I think the management of the open space within a forest management unit, I think it is covered quite well. I think I'm seeing examples in the park where it is spreading onto third parties' land that does become a much more nuanced and tricky thing to be managed. And I think it's as Tom says, it's an issue that I think we're all aware of, but quite how that is managed. Obviously, new woodlands, there's ways to put that in, but yeah, there's certain examples where, yeah, there's impacts more in the park, maybe not on designated sites, but on degrading peats, which probably, and there's an issue there about whether that becomes eligible for peatland action work and stuff. So yeah, there's some interesting complexities there as well, which hopefully will be bottomed out as time goes on.
Okay, thanks, Simon. A couple of things, and there's a question from David Walsh in the chat as well. Just a question about the, I think the question is, it just says in relation to the research, I mentioned how landowners learn from each other and their networks. So my question is whether and how the National Park helps with this kind of networking support, if at all. And I guess I'll probably pass that to Simon, but just to say as well that, I mean, you know, the park has in the past done work, and also I guess the park has, it's fair to say, limited capacity in some respects and quite a lot on their plate, but nevertheless it is an important point, I think. So I don't know if you wanted to mention, comment on that.
Yes, no, obviously the work that Rob was doing, we envisioned a lot of these follow-up seminars would be face-to-face, so trying to work on the actual face-to-face engagement. We have run or supported various events at places like Cashel, and there were other events planned following from the Trees and Woodland strategy, which COVID have put the brakes on. But we do run a land management network newsletter that comes out about every month, every 6 weeks, where it's a general update about what's happening in the park, and there are woodland specific articles within that. But it's something that we are looking at maybe taking forward, is actually maybe having, some of you may be aware of things like the monitor farms, where people can go and visit farms that may be doing certain things. The idea of taking that model to actually get neighbours looking at other people's woodlands and having that discussion is something I was fair to say would want to have done if we hadn't have had COVID. So we are trying to build in some more face-to-face meetings. So yeah, there's various aspects there, and we hold meetings with SLE and NFUS as well, and there's work there that colleagues of mine, we've got 2 land management advisors that maybe lead on the direct engagement with landowners, but we are looking to bring more events forward as when restrictions allow. Yeah,
it's an interesting balance, because obviously some of the stuff that I'm referring to as well is happening kind of organically, and it's like the over the fence thing where you see your neighbour do a thing, or you see an agent working with a neighbour or something, and then 2 years down the line, you know, there's a woodland there, or, you know, at the beginnings of a woodland, and so you start to chat to them, and then, you know, depending on your relationship, some of them took on woodland schemes exactly because of that reason. So it's not necessarily the park organising event, but it's then how do you sort of stimulate some of that to happen a little bit more sometimes, and I guess that's where the facilitation role comes in a little bit more. See, John Holland's posted up as well in the chat, just that for those interested, there was an interesting episode of Radio 4's On Your Farm a couple of weeks ago from Throne Farm. Yeah, was there another post that I missed as well? Oh yeah, and just that there's an there's a link to the agroforestry handbook in the chat as well. Can I just ask if anyone out there has a perspective on woodland creation? You know, if anyone has undertaken or attempted to undertake woodland creation, or is in the throes of the scheme. Is there anyone out there that would want to? And I've got a question from Matt that I'll come to as well. Did anybody want to comment on a scheme that they have done or have tried to do? Would anyone want to comment on that? I'm going to take that to it. You either don't want to comment or you haven't. No, people here haven't been doing schemes. But you have a question from Matt. Can I see you? No. Matt's just asked, is there a deadline for the grant applications? I was looking recently, and I think it said applications were to be submitted March to May. That's probably for you, Tom.
No, there is no deadline. You can submit an application any time of the year. That may be another scheme perhaps you're looking at, but through Forestry Grant Scheme you can submit any time of the year. Now through late summer into autumn and early winter is a very busy time for applications as people prepare their work for next year, but there's no deadline.
Okay. And one thing I wanted to ask, seeing as everyone's here, and it obviously comes up a lot, is this idea of, you know, and you pointed out as well, both of you very helpfully, Simon and Tom, that there is an additional grant, if you like, available in the park for targeted types of woodland. But you know, it was raised, this thing about the Central Scotland Green Network and top-ups in general. And I know there's been locational premiums in the past. But presumably my thinking on it was, well, they cost a lot of money, obviously, because they were quite substantial. Some of them, the Central Scotland Green Network, will certainly cost a lot of money, which is, you know, taxpayers' money. So there's obviously a balance there between doing something like that, which is paid for by the taxpayer, in a time when actually forestry markets are doing quite well. Forestry is getting much more viable as a land use change relative to agriculture, for example. So I was just wondering what people thought about that sort of approach in general, given there's already a bit of a top up there anyway, but it's maybe not at the same level of the sort of thing like Central Scotland Green Networks. Anyone have a comment on that?
Rob, an interesting angle that perhaps people aren't aware of is there is a loan scheme available now for smaller scale woodland creation schemes. You get your capital funding once you've done the planting and the fencing. But you can apply for this upfront funding to help with the cost of doing your application and with the fencing and cultivation, etc., to help with your cash flow. So you're not having to carry that cash flow. And then when you draw down your first capital claim, the loan you've been given against that capital claim is deducted. So it helps with your cash flow. And that could be a tipping point to encourage people to do a scheme that they might not otherwise have done because they can't afford to, potentially.
Yeah. Okay. And a couple of points there. A question from Jane first, following on from the agroforestry points. Yeah, one of the recommendations was about training and skills courses or woodland creation course for farmers. Yeah, good question. Does the panel think there would be good uptake of that from farmers, or can be more done first to raise general awareness, appetite among the farming community, and by whom? I mean, it's a fair question because, you know, you kind of make recommendations for training or events, but then if you don't get the kind of an uptake, or, you know, if it's what's paying for it and so on. Tom, do you want to come in on that? Or
yeah, I know we've got a farming advisor in Scottish Forestry who I understand is doing a lot of this work. She might be on the meeting. I'm not sure if she's still here. Lynn's still a little in the meeting. She could perhaps...
Lynn has just posted a comment, actually. Yeah.
Right. Well, feel free to speak, Lynn. You know, you might be able to explain it much better than me because I know you've been doing a lot of work. But it's been there's been a number of events online, obviously, over the last year and a half. But I'm sure there's in-person events which we aspire to do as well.
Yeah. Lynn has just posted that not in the park, but a good way to hear from farmers on their practical experiences integrating trees in your land and the farming for a better climate. And there's a link to that there. Lynn, did you want to come in on that? There's no obligation to, no pressure. If you want to.
No, I just posted that. As I say, it's not within the park, but we've got 3 host farmers already. We've had events where we've done one with the Crofton community as well. We've got another 2 events coming up just shortly. One of them's based in the southwest. It's around a farmer down there that's done the sheep and trees option. So you're looking at diverse conifer with infrastructure. So it's like a woodland creation grant along with an infrastructure grant. So that's a really interesting one to look at the benefits from that. And we've also got an event on the 14th of October, another virtual one that will be at the Barbers at Mains of Finn Castle. So again, we'll get their idea on how they've planted trees on their farm, how it's benefited them and that kind of thing. We've got another crofters meeting on the 28th, which is teas and trees. So again, that's the kind of smaller scale crofters learning from each other what they've actually done on the ground, inviting people along with their questions and that. So we had one a couple of weeks ago and it went down really well. So this is why we're having another one. So the network is farmer led. So it's a case of what are farmers interested, have the host farmers there. We are looking at, after the teas and trees meeting, we'll probably do a shelter design, woodland shelter design event later on this year. So it is farmer led. So if people have got ideas of what they would like farmers to discuss or hosts to discuss, specialist speakers and that kind of thing. So it's open to everybody across Scotland. As I say, the one for the Perth office is actually Mains of Finn Castle one. We don't actually have one in the park at the moment.
Thanks, Lynn. And I'm guessing, given the current levels of interest, you're seeing good uptake.
Yes, we've had the events we've had so far have been well attended and that kind of thing. I'll put the link into the website there because it's got a fair bit of information about our hosts and what they've done. They're all quite different. The hosts that we've got so far, why they've planted trees and their experiences and everything like that. And we'll have case studies coming, obviously, in the next wee while as well. So keep an eye out on the Scottish Forestry Twitter. The events are all announced there and the work that we're doing. And obviously it goes on the SAC FAS website as well, the events that we have.
Great, thanks, Lynn. Yeah, I should say as well, there's a huge amount of information which is very clearly presented on the Scottish Forestry website as well. And I guess in general, the amount of information out there in relation to new woodland creation has increased quite a lot over the last sort of 5 or 6 years. And there are other webinars and things like this as well. I know that they've been recorded. And another useful source is the Farm Advisory Service, and FAS have a number of recorded sessions and various sessions planned, I think, in relation to these sorts of topics. Can I just check if anybody else has anything that they'd want to share, just comments or questions or thoughts on any of this? Yeah, Matt, you've got to see your hand up.
Yeah, I was just wondering about the application for it's got the different section for the Highlands or the Western Isles, and I was wondering if there was any. Is there a recommendation as to what you're supposed to be planting because it's a different section on its own as opposed to having a like conifer or native broadleaves or whatever? Does that come with a recommendation, or that's something that we're supposed to be doing differently if we're on the Western Isles?
Okay.
Yeah, I suppose I'd come in and answer that question as best I can. I think the aspiration of that option, I assume, Matt, you're talking about the native broadleaves in Northern and Western Isles option?
Right, it is native broadleaves rather than
Yeah, it is. There's a much higher planting rate and a much higher stocking density to reflect the challenges of establishing woodlands in those kind of locations. And it's not something we deal with in Perth and Argyll, so I don't have any direct knowledge, but it appears to be for native broadleaves and mixed broadleaves. Now, let's say conifers. I'd imagine there's a small percentage of conifers allowed, probably Scots, to help the native broadleaves establish. But it's something that Highland Conservancy deal with, so we don't tend to deal with it in Perth and Argyll, but it is principally native trees that the option's designed for, with a higher rate and higher stocking density, but quite small. I don't know if there's a maximum block size. Yeah, 3 hectares is the maximum block size. Generally, when the rate's higher, like this option and the small farm woodland option, there's a maximum block size to encourage, because the cost associated with a small woodland can be quite significant considering the grant rate. So for those kind of options, there is an increased rate.
Okay. And what is is there a minimum density or the planting cost?
Yes, 3,000 stems per hectare at year. So it's quite a lot higher. So the native broadleaf option, for example, will be 1,600 stems per hectare. So it's almost double that for the Northern and Western Isles option.
Yeah. Okay.
Hope that answers your question, Matt.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay. I would maybe ask you to follow up on that, but I'll go to Lynn first, because Lynn, I think you've got your hand up, unless that's an old hand, is it? Do you also want to have a question?
No, it was just when you mentioned FAS and that kind of thing. They've actually, I'm just going to post it just now. They actually do a kind of, you can apply for up to £1,000 of funding to get a forestry consultant onto your farm. So if you're looking at possibly planting or anything like that, or just want somebody to come and have a look, you can apply for the funding. The funding is really easy to apply for. I'll just post it up there and people can have a look at it.
Thanks, Lynn. Yeah, I mean, I've definitely noticed a number of schemes like that now, which you should clearly be able to get support, I think, or at least attempt to get support to get a consultant in. And I know some of the agencies anyway. Andrew could maybe correct me if I'm wrong on this. I don't know if he'll do it, but I know that some of them are doing free initial visits anyway. I don't know if that goes as far as doing an options appraisal or whatever, but there's definitely more support than there used to be out there. Like the national parks both have schemes now.
Yeah, I mean, my managers are members of the Institute of Chartered Foresters, so we act completely professionally at all times, and therefore, if we get a phone call, we will go and meet the landowner, go and look at what they want to do, and we'll give them a quote for cash flow. So we'll go to all the trouble of working it through and talking about what their options are, and then coming up with a draft design and costing that, and it doesn't cost you a penny to get that far. And the idea being is once you've got a budget and if you like what you see, you've got a cash flow in front of you, then we kick on from there, and we then start doing the grant application based on that draft design that's been put in front of you. So. Yeah.
So really, there's no reason not to do an initial inquiry, I suppose. It's probably fair to say at this stage. But I can see there's another hand raised there from Captain Jacob. Jacob. Yeah, so the hand there.
Yes, hi. So this may be a pretty stupid question, but when you mentioned that the Sitka spruce plantations would have to be limited to avoid the Sitka going into the neighbor's gardening and establishing itself there, does that mean that Sitka spruce in particular would not be included in any of the mixes, coniferous or like native mixes that you would have when you're trying to a forest for the sake of environmental reasons instead of timber?
Yes. Yeah, we would choose not to plant Sitka spruce. We plant other species, Scots pine, Caledonian Scots pine, for example.
Thank you.
Can I make a couple of comments?
Yes.
I'm involved with the Highland Perthshire Communities Land Trust, which is 440 hectares of community acquired land east of Schiehallion. And you're talking about training courses. We do run 2 courses a year of 3 or 4 young people to learn rural skills like diking and chainsawing and various things. And they go away a certificate. So that's happened. And are you aware of the Heart of Scotland Forest, which is a consortium of JM John Muir Trust, Scottish Wildlife Trust, Highland Perthshire Community Land Trust, and 2 private landowners and the Forest Commission, or whatever they are now, who are spreading their Sitka to us. But we're all joined together in a sort of landscape linking, forest linking enterprise, just for your information.
That's helpful. Thanks for that. Matt, I can see you've got your hand up, but I'm not sure if that might be an old hand from your previous question. I'm not sure. I wasn't watching. I wasn't keeping an eye on it. be an old hand, isn't it? Yeah. An old hand, I think. Because I just actually on Matt's questions, because it just made me think of something about tree failure rates and that, and planting in the Western Isles, you know, like a pretty difficult area to establish. So obviously that's why the planting rate is higher. And I'm aware that, you know, you can lose some of your grant if you don't get like a sufficient level of success in your scheme. Did Tom or anyone else want to comment on that? Tom, maybe it's for you that, you know, in relation to tree failure rates and potential loss of grant payments, and, you know, yeah, just a general comment on that, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, it's important we protect the public investment. We're protecting public,
Yeah.
we're investing public money. It's important that we ensure that we deliver public benefit for public money. And it is difficult because just because we plant a tree in the ground doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be there in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And so, as Andrew pointed out, the maintenance is very important. We give both the capital payment and the maintenance payment to ensure the establishment of trees. If there is a failure, then we have to look to reclaim public money where there hasn't been delivery and public benefit. So that's a reality of the scheme. We want it to succeed though, and we work hard at application stage with the applicant to ensure that the ground that's proposed is suitable, that the management methods are appropriate to ensure the trees survival as best they can. But we recognise we also work in the natural world where a very dry spring or a very late frost or a very heavy late snowfall or a whole range of things can cause some challenges. And I'm sure Angie would comment on this, that budgets often include some of that reality in the costings they provide to their clients, because we have to recognise that.
I mean, give you an idea, Tom. You know, we normally have use less than 5% replacement planting is needed, but this past winter we have a site in Kintyre. We've lost 25% of our trees that we planted because they were planted in January. They sat under snow for 2 months, and the deer just came along and ripped them out and ate them. And as the snow melted, they then got frosted, and then they went into a drought. You know, they literally. So you can't. You know, we're normally very good at what we do, but that was just a weird one where all the environmental circumstances just worked against us for 3 or 4 months.
Yeah. Okay. I think we've probably got time for one more question or comment if anybody wants to come in on anything. Any final comments or questions on any aspects of the discussion today from you? Or anything that I didn't get to? No. I think it probably. If anybody wants to follow up on anything with me directly, that's absolutely fine. My email's on the workshop details online anyway. And I think if you want to follow up with other speakers, are probably open to that, or just go via me if you prefer, because you've got my email. One other thing to mention is that we are doing some work at the moment. It's a strategic advisory group which is being put together, which is also another safari project on carbon, and not just woodland carbon. I think that will be peatland carbon as well. I'm doing a roundtable event on that, so there will be probably more safari stuff on carbon, I guess is the point to make there. And we have 2 more workshops, which you'll all have seen anyway, because you'll have seen the workshops information. So that is online. It's on the same place that you originally would have seen this, or it's on the Safari website, or if you just type Woodland Creation Workshops, Safari website, you'll find it there as well. One is at the end of the month, which is a field visit or a site visit to Kirkton and Ochter SREC farm, to discuss farm woodlands and agroforestry in particular. And the third event then is on woodland carbon and carbon schemes and generating income from carbon at different scales, which is 20th or 21st of October, I think it is, in the afternoon. I think it's 4 to 6 for that one, just to encourage a few more land managers or farmers to come along. So I think if nobody else has anything else to add on any of this, or to remind me of anything that I've forgotten to say, I think we can probably draw this to a close. And just to say a big thank you again to Andrew and Simon and Tom, and also Andrew Keogh for giving a safari perspective at the start there today. And thanks to all of you guys for joining us and for taking a couple of hours out of your day to join this session. Okay. And I will end it there. Thanks a lot, folks.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.